one of the extremely valuable and really, I think, right on objections and concerns about any kind of embrace of evolutionary theory is the implications that it has for biblical interpretation. Biblical interpretation, people who balk at embracing evolutionary theory say we're about to get on a slippery slope. If we say yes to evolution, then we have to say no to a literal interpretation of Genesis 1 to 3. You can't have both, and I think that's probably true. I think it's going to be really, really difficult to see how those two could be truly integrated. And so then that brings up the question of biblical authority and interpretation. Because on the one hand, as evangelicals, there's no way, I don't think you can be evangelical and not suggest that Scripture and the Bible ultimately has authority in faith and life for people. So you're committed to biblical authority. That I'm not certain, though, that doesn't give some wiggle room in terms of interpretation. But the question then becomes, how do you keep the Bible as authoritative? How does it continue to speak into life if you can't just say straight up everything's 100% literal and it's kind of black and white? Once you get out of like a black and white view of literal interpretation, are you then committed to utter relativism? Are there any stopgaps on that slippery slope? And to be fair, it's challenging. It really is. And for those who want to just pretend like it's not a problem, I think it is. I think we have to be really, really cautious about how quickly we're willing to jettison our views about interpretation. And there is a danger that once we let go of certain markers for interpretation, then we are going to go into anarchy. And that happens. It happens in the academy. I see it all the time. People who treat the scriptures the same way that Jacques Derrida treats any text, which is you deconstruct and you use it as you see fit. Reader response criticism is an actual theory of interpretation. Doesn't matter what's on the page. Doesn't matter what the words say. What matters is how I respond. And as evangelicals, we can't go there. And so if you want to go into a view of creation that involves evolutionary processes, you have to have some way of protecting biblical authority. One way that some people have used, and I think I have faithful friends who go this way, and I think it's valuable. They'll say something like, well, if we're going to read the creation account, for example, we need to read it in its historical context. And through good hard-nosed scholarly research, we're going to find out that really probably the final form of what we have in Genesis 1 to 3 was probably completed during the Babylonian exile, in the midst of a context, 6th century BC, something like that, in the midst of a context in which Jewish or Hebrew peoples were in exile, and they were being confronted with different views of what the God or the gods were like. And part of that would be how the universe came to be. And so we have some creation myths from the period that indicate that there was like this epic struggle between this god and that god, or this god over the human beings, and this god wanted to oppress them and increase that god's slavery, and just all these very, very contentious, very very violent, very chaotic ways of describing the origins of the universe. And really what you end up getting is you get this sense that like whoever the god or the gods are, they're over here, and then there's like chaos or utter negation and nothingness, and they're locked in this combat. And the end of that combat, when things go right, is something like what we have, the actual creation that we have. And if you look at Genesis 1 to 3 in that light, you say, wow, whatever you're going to say about it, it certainly is pushing against these notions of cosmic chaos and cosmic battle, as if Creator God doesn't have utter control. And the Genesis account wants to say, no, Yahweh is Creator God. Yahweh is in charge. Yahweh is King of Kings, Lord of Lords. And so when Yahweh decides to do things, they get done. And our universe and our lives are one of the things that Yahweh decided to do, and so it got done. And it wasn't as though Yahweh had to worry about some chaos monster trying to negate all of the universe. That's just not on his radar, because Yahweh is bigger and stronger and mightier than anything like that. Now, what's just been done is we've taken kind of a historical perspective on the text and said, well, this is kind of how it developed, this is what it was used for, and then we've said that the value, the interpretive value, comes from what the truths that it was trying to communicate in the time, and that those truths can, somehow be applicable or relevant to our own time. Whatever you want to say about an interpretation like that, I do want to suggest that it does protect us from interpretive anarchy. It does protect us from a slippery slope, because there are still canons and standards of meaning that that we can't get beyond. We're not just, it's not willy-nilly. It's interpretation that it's governed, and it's limited in its abilities to say what is or is not the case. Now, is it as black and white and as clear-cut as what you might call literal interpretation? No. But I also want to suggest that if you get really technical and you get really critical about literal interpretation, you're going to see that it too has many nuances, and it too depends on a lot of theological presuppositions and ideas and frameworks to sort of work, to sort of create a coherent, integrated account of what the scriptures mean and say. So first, I want to validate anyone who's concerned about slippery slopes. It is a concern, and I'm concerned about it too. And I think good Christian interpretation needs to be concerned about it. But I also want to say I do think that there's probably ways for people to read a biblical text without going on slippery slopes, and ways for people to incorporate evolutionary theory into their faith without becoming radical relativists, or without becoming totally ungoverned by the scriptures. I do think I know people who set up these safeguards and set up these interpretive canons in their faith to prevent that from happening. So are we going to worry about a slippery slope? Yes. And because we're worried about it, we're going to be diligent to develop theological reasons and limits to interpretation to make sure we don't end up sliding all the way down.